I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard Russell Library at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. Our guest is Don Johnson, former Georgia State Senator and a Congressman from Georgia's 10th District. Don, we're delighted to have you as our guest.
Thank you, Bob. Good to see you again.
Born in Atlanta, spent most of your life in Royston.
That's right. Yeah, my father was in Emory Law School when I was born, and I was born in 1948. And he was just starting Emory Law School, so the first 3 years I lived there in various spots around Emory. And but he and I, he always wanted to move back to Royston. And I'll never forget him coming when I was a little boy, about 3 years old, and we'd talk about what we're going to do when we move back to Royston. And I'd say stuff like go fishing, you know, and go to Slickery Rock. That was his favorite spot in, near where we lived. But moved back to Royston and grew up there. My father was the district attorney. First he was solicitor. They called it Solicitor General, and they changed the name of it in the mid-60s, I think. My grandfather, his father, had been practicing law there since 1911. And he also was in politics. He was in the state house, state senator, and then under Eugene Talmadge, he was assistant attorney general. You know, I guess I've got politics a little bit in my genes from them. And in fact, my great-grandfather, who was named Judge Jerome Bates, he wasn't a judge, but he was a lawyer. But he had the name Judge Jerome Bates, and he was in the state house in the 1880s, and then again in about 1920. Mm-hmm. And he lived up there kind of near where you do, except a little bit further to the northwest, a place called Spring Place. And but he practiced law up there and was a state legislator. And my grandmother, he was on my grandmother's side. And she used to tell a story about they went out into Oklahoma in a covered wagon with him, and they got a bunch of Indians came up on him one time, and he told them to get under the wagon. And, but it was, you know, a very interesting story about that. But I never, of course, knew him because he died in the 30s, but I knew a lot about him. And from her. She was part Indian, and so am I, of course. And it came through the Bates family.
Tell us about your father. He was a prosecutor at the Lemuel Penn murder trial. That's
right. That was in 1964, right after the Civil Rights Act had been enacted. And his district included Madison County and Elbert County. He had a 5-county region, but there was a group of Ku Klux Klansmen that hung out over here in Athens, and one night in July of 1964, Lemuel Penn and 2 other officers in the reserves of the Army were driving back from Fort Benning, and that was before I-85 was built, and they were taking the back roads. And they drove through Athens, and a group of Klansmen followed them out of town, and all the way up to on Highway 172 as they were crossing the Broad River. Bill Shipp wrote a book about murder at Broad River Bridge, and it's about that story. And so as they crossed in to that county, it entered my dad's district, and so he prosecuted that case. Now, as I said, my father and grandfather were lawyers, and I didn't know very much about the law, except my dad would come home complaining about a jury verdict he might have lost, and I didn't think I ever wanted to be a lawyer because of that, because he complained so much about, you know, different things that happened in his practice. But he took us all to that trial because it was a big event. It was covered from, you know, the Washington Post and the Newsweek and, you know, LA Times. All of the papers in America came to converge on Danielsville, Georgia. where they had the trial. And my dad prosecuted it, and that's when I got interested in the law. Also became a big admirer of his for his courage, because he did a really outstanding job. He brought in another prosecutor to help him with it, because back then they didn't have assistant DAs, and he handled the whole thing. But a fellow by the name of Wayne, I can't think of his first name now, but came from Gainesville.
Jeff Wayne.
Jeff Wayne, that's right. And they tried it together, and then at the end, my dad gave a terrific closing argument. And among the things that he said was, have the courage to do what's right, talking to the jury. And the state of Georgia is on trial here. Will we convict when there's a crime committed in our county? And unfortunately, they didn't convict. They acquitted him. They had some confessions by one of them that he later repudiated the confession, but they still entered it into the record. And I've got an editorial by the Washington Post in my office now that was praising my father and for the prosecution, and quoted from his closing argument. So I know that he did a good job, and from that time forward, I became interested in becoming a lawyer. But that had a big effect on me in a lot of ways, politically, as well as having a conscience about what was going on in the world at that time. The next big event that happened in my life that had an impact on my political philosophy and outlook on life was 1968. That was the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated. Then Robert Kennedy was assassinated. I was a fraternity boy over here at the university, and was interested primarily in drinking beer and chasing girls. And just as I had been in high school, I was interested in high school football and other things, and this kind of woke me up. Well, 1968 was a big year, not only because of those two assassinations, but also because of the riots that took place at the Democratic Convention. And it was the year of the President Johnson deciding not to run after the Tet Offensive, which we actually won, but the results on television didn't look that way. And it really shook my conscience as to what was going on in the world. But over the years, I always became strong Democrat, and part of it was that, even though that was a very difficult time for the Democratic Party, and I've never changed. Supported George McGovern for president. I'll never forget walking around. I was a first-year law student then, and going to a football game in the stadium here with a McGovern button on, just out of defiance, because there are a lot of people most people didn't, want to re-elect Richard Nixon. But when I graduated from law school, I had an Air Force commitment. I was an ROTC student at the university, and had gotten an educational delay. I was going to be a pilot, and but my eyes went bad. At least they weren't 20/20 when I left law school, so I got in the JAG program. But before I did, I got Phil Landrum, who was congressman from the 9th District at that time, to give me a job to work for him until the Air Force called me in. Mm-hmm. And he was on the Ways and Means Committee, as you might remember. Mm-hmm. He was the third ranking member. I always forget, when I went to Congress later, if he had lived to the time I went to Congress, he still wouldn't have been chairman, because he was right behind Dan Rostenkowski. And I used to sit behind him and Rostenkowski and listen to Rostenkowski tell these crazy stories, and sometimes he'd forget to turn his mic off and say something kind of raunchy, but it was a very interesting time for me, because I was straight out of law school, and they took up the trade bill of 1974. It was actually 73. It was called the the Trade Reform Act of 73 when I was working on it, because I moved from his staff to the Ways and Means Committee staff. It was a real interesting time because that was when Watergate was going on. And but the Ways and Means Committee, the chairman was Wilbur Mills, and very interesting character. He later got in trouble with Fannie Fox, but when I was there, I would watch him closely because he was a very smart man. He Harvard Law School, you know, he wrote the 1954 tax code. But we were taking up this major trade reform bill. And I had been studying under Dean Rusk here at the law school, and I was very interested in international law. That's what I wanted to do. I was driving on campus the day I heard on the radio that Rusk was coming here. And I thought, well, you know, I'm not sure I can get in any other law school. May not be able to get in this one, but I want to come here because of Rusk. Even though I was at that time opposed to the Vietnam War, because I thought it was more of a internal, you know, revolution as opposed to, you know, Chinese communist-inspired activity that was going to create a domino effect throughout the rest of the world. But I had great respect for Rusk, and when I was in law school, he became a great mentor of mine. I consider him to be the most influential man in my life besides my father. Even though he didn't always know it, you know, but I just by watching him, and he helped me with a number of things, and I was close to him the rest of his life. In fact, the last time I saw him was when I was in Congress and had just lost my election. I wanted to say this about Rusk. This was we were at the Georgia Tech game, and I had been invited by Chuck Knapp, who was the president of the college then, or the university then, and to sit in the president's box. And Rusk was sitting in the back smoking a lark. You know, even though they had prohibited smoking in the stadium at that point, especially in the president's box, but he was allowed to do it because he, you know, was so old and respected. And I looked over at him. He looked at me and he said, "Better luck next time." And you know, he had contributed to my campaign. I didn't even want to cash the checks because I thought so much of him and I wanted to save it, but I spent it anyway. Mm-hmm. And but I just mentioned that as a story about Rusk. But when I was on the Ways and Means Committee staff, they only had 25 members of the committee. It's a lot bigger now. Had no subcommittees. And they only had one staff member working on trade at that time. Now they got Republican staff, Democratic staff, and professional staff, and it's, you know, just doing trade work. But at that time, I was an economist that I worked for when Landrum got me the job working for the Committee on Trade because I was interested in international law. And I'll never forget one day, this guy was a very quiet guy. He was an economist, and you know, just thought like an economist. And I never even knew what his political positions were because we were on the professional staff. You know, it was, of course, they're all hired by Wilbur Mills, was in charge of everything. But he never expressed much political opinion. But one day I was over at the Capitol, and I saw Spiro Agnew come out of the door. And of course, he was, you know, vice president at the time, and it was nothing. I mean, he was a very controversial figure because of the speeches he gave and everything. But he was walking out of the door, and I saw he had kind of a grim look on his face, and he got in this limousine and drove off. And I turned to a guy that was there at the door and said, "Was that Agnew?" And he said, "Yeah, it was. He just turned in his resignation to Carl Albert, the speaker at the time." And I said, "My God." You know, I had no idea why he turned in his resignation. But I walked back across the street to the Longworth building where the Ways and Means Committee was. And I went up to Harry Lamar, who was the staff person I was telling you about, the economist. And I said, "Harry, you won't believe what just happened. Spiro Agnew just resigned." And he said, he looked at me and he stood up and said, "Hot damn, one down and one to go." You know, it just totally took me by surprise because this guy, you know, he'd never said anything about Nixon or anything else. But that whole time I was up there, and I went over and spoke to Herman Talmadge, because my grandfather was a big Gene Talmadge man, and my father was very loyal to the Talmadges, and I always thought a lot of Herman. I mean, he had some flaws like we all do, but he was real sharp on that Watergate committee. And so I took the opportunity to go over and speak with him, and he was very kind to me. And as I walked in the door, I saw the political poster on the wall. You may have seen it saying, Gene Talmadge, dirt farmer. Of course, he was a lawyer and very astute student of different things, but he wanted to be known as a dirt farmer. But also, I got to sit in on some of the Watergate hearings that went on. I saw Edelman and Haldeman give their testimony. And so it was a very interesting time to be there. But then I went in the Air Force about 8 months later. And after we got the bill passed, I mean, I say we, the only thing I did was, help this economist. And then I wrote Landrum's speech on that he gave on the floor on the trade bill. But so I spent 4 years in the Air Force. My first year was in California at Vandenberg Air Force Base, a missile base out there. And most people would have liked to have stayed there for the full 4 years, but I was too antsy. My first son was born there, Cleet, named after my father. And I volunteered along with the advice and consent of my spouse, Suzanne. We went to Turkey. We volunteered to go to Turkey for a 2-year assignment. And it was a really interesting time to be there. And it was right after the Turks had invaded Cyprus, and the U.S. Congress had imposed an embargo on Turkey. And one of my jobs as a judge advocate was to visit Americans who'd been locked up in Turkish jails. And I remember going down there to the big jail at the city where we lived, and meeting the warden. And I don't think he spoke any English except for one word. He said to me, "Embargo, çok fena." That means, very bad in Turkish. And but I really enjoyed that time because we were down on the Mediterranean. It's right across the border from Syria. My wife and I drove down to Beirut once, and then really all over the place. We traveled to Russia and Egypt, and a lot of interesting places from that center. And it caused me to become more and more interested in international affairs and international politics. So when I graduated, when I finished my tour of duty in Turkey, I thought it was time for me to get out. I had served 3 of my 4-year commitment, and I thought, well, they don't want to pay for me to go to another base and then get out a year later. But they didn't go for it. They wanted me to stay. So we went to Denver, Colorado at Lowry Air Force Base, which is not there anymore, but it was where there was a prison. And so I tried about 25 courts-martials during the time I was there. There weren't many courts-martials at Vandenberg or in Turkey. I had a few. I represented both the defense and I was mainly a prosecutor, but we had so few people we had to cover both bases. So that was most of my criminal trial experience. I never really tried any criminal cases after that. But I decided I wanted to go back to school and study international law more. So I got accepted in the London School of Economics, which the full name is London School of Economics and Political Science, and they have a law faculty there. It's highly respected, and I studied international economic law, which was mainly international trade law, European law, and some comparative law courses, because I got interested in international trade while working on the Ways and Means Committee. So that was kind of my introduction to international trade, which played a big role later in my life. But after I graduated from the LSE, I was wanting to go back to Washington, but and I had a friend that was in Chicago. We were debating. My wife got this really good job teaching at the American School in London, and they paid American wages, which back then was a lot higher than British wages. And we were enjoying living in London, so I thought, well, I might like to stay here a little bit longer. And I had a friend that worked for Continental Bank in Chicago, as a fraternity brother of mine here at Georgia, and we were, really close friends. And he said, well, you should come. I asked him if Continental Bank, which is a big, 7th largest bank in the country at the time, and it had a big branch in London. And I was going to see if they hired lawyers in London. And he said he found out that they didn't, but he said, and I was coming back to Washington to do some interviews, and he talked me into coming to Chicago to interview there. And when I went to Washington, things had changed quite a bit. Number one, Jimmy Carter was president. This was in 1978, and there were too many Georgians in Washington. It was hard to get a job as a Georgian at that time if you didn't know the right people, and I really didn't. So I decided to go to Chicago and interviewed there, and they offered me a job and said they'd pay for me to, move my furniture back from London and everything else. And it was a, real interesting job. And I was interested in international finance, and so that's what I did for the next 2 years in Chicago. I did international finance at this bank in Chicago. In Chicago, I found to be a great town. It was awfully cold in the wintertime and awfully hot in the summertime. But it's a great city, and my wife and I and young son enjoyed living there. But decided it was time to move back to Georgia in 1980. So I stayed there for 2 years, and I interviewed with a number of firms in Atlanta and had 2 offers, and one of them was with Powell Goldstein, Frazier and Murphy, which has been absorbed now by another firm, but it's still got a lot of good people there. And it turned out my grandfather was a close friend of Buck Murphy. You remember who that is. He was a good Talmadge man, and Buck Murphy was still alive. He was retired, and he died not too long after I got there, but he was still there. And my grandfather, I had some correspondence between him and Buck Murphy when my grandfather would associate Powell Goldstein to handle a case, that was in Atlanta, and he didn't want to go there and so forth. But so I stayed there for 2 years, and I decided that I didn't like being an associate in a big firm. And they weren't doing the kind of international law that I was interested in. They were, representing German and Japanese investors in Georgia. So it was really just Georgia law with a foreign client. That's what they called international law back in the 80s, in Atlanta anyway. And so I got to thinking that, I might like to move back to my hometown. My father and grandfather had practiced law there since 1911. This was 1982, and against my father's best advice, I moved back there. A lot of fathers like for you to move back home. Well, he thought I was crazy, giving up a good job in Atlanta, with a big firm, and coming back and struggling as a young lawyer, because he was already retired. But what I did was I moved back there and used his name, and we formed the partnership of Johnson & Johnson, just like he did when he moved back after graduating from Emory in 1952. So I started practicing and just basically had to create the practice. He was still doing a little bit of real estate work, but really not much else. And he died 3 years after I got back there, which was kind of a sudden thing, because he was only 69 and a little bit too young to die, but unfortunately that's what happened. But one of the reasons I moved back was because I was interested in politics. and I had some friends who were in politics. Pierre Howard was my really close friend from all the way back to the University of Georgia, and others. I had Joe Frank Harris was governor, and he had a top aide, Rusty Sewell. Rusty and I were in law school together, but he also was my cousin. And so I started talking with them after my father died. I had some people come want me to run for state representative, and my dad was still alive, and he said, "Don't do that." He'd been through it, because he ran for state representative. He had been mayor of Royston. My grandfather had been mayor of Royston. I didn't get to be mayor of Royston because I moved out of town in 1985, and I was city attorney and city judge, and really enjoyed my law practice there, but I didn't really do anything in politics until 1987. I was real interested in the state senate, and Parks Brown, who got very ill in the first session of 1987, died in about April or May of that year. And Pierre Howard called me and said, "Look, if you would like to run for the state senate, I've got a fellow who helped me in my last campaign. He'll help you, and I'd like to give you all the help I can get." And then I talked to Rusty and several others, and I decided, well, I think I'll run for office, and I'll just keep my law practice going. And then after 5 o'clock, before it gets dark, I'll get out and start handing out some cards. Because that was my recollection of what politics was about at that point, because when my dad ran for Solicitor General the first time, he actually had been appointed to office by Marvin Griffin. Marvin Griffin was a good friend of my grandfather's, and he asked my grandfather if he would like to be a judge, because the judge died in that circuit. And my grandfather said, "No, why don't you appoint the Solicitor General to judge, Cary Skelton, and appoint my son to be Solicitor General." And so that's how he got to be appointed. But within 2 years, he had to run for re-election because it was in the middle of the term when he got appointed. And he had a very difficult race against William Oscar Carter, who later became a good friend of mine and was a friend of my dad's too. But they had a vicious campaign against each other. In my recollection of that, I was only about 8 or 10 years old. This was in 1958, so I was 10 years old. And I remember going around with my father while he was campaigning, and he'd get out and go to the little grocery stores and the gas stations and hand out cards, and I thought that was all there was to it. And so when I decided to run for the state senate, I was just going to keep my law practice going. I had an associate who could do a good bit of the work, and I had this paralegal who was doing a lot. And I thought, well, I can just take off at 5 o'clock. It doesn't get dark till about 8, and I'll just hand out some cards and get elected. Well, it wasn't too long after I started that I realized that if I had any chance of winning, I was going to have to give up my law practice for that period. And fortunately, it was a short period because after Parks died, I had a special election. You only got 6 weeks or so to do it. So I hit the ground running, and with Pierre's friends' help, we had a pretty sophisticated campaign. Most everybody was making the signs out with stencils, and this guy decided we should do it in a much more sophisticated way. So we put up these 4x8 signs all over the district, and the district ran from Elbert County, which was is pretty far away from one end to the other. The other was up near Winder. Of course, it was Jackson County, but when you got off at Brazelton, you went from Brazelton to almost Wilkes County or Lincoln County, and So it's a pretty long way, but we put these things up in a matter of a week all over the district. And it looked like I was, you know, the man to beat at that point. And there were a lot of other people in the race. We had about eight people in the race. And I was able to get in the runoff with John B. O'Neill, who is a doctor in Elberton, and he's a good friend of Zell's. And Zell was the lieutenant governor at that time. And but we had this runoff, and fortunately I was able to win. And Zell called me right after the election and congratulated me. And he said, "I want you to know, I know there were some people that were saying that I was helping John B. and I wasn't. But I said, well, look, that's fine, that's over, and you know, I'm just looking forward to working with you." And so right away he gave me some great committee assignments. He made me vice chairman of the Judiciary Committee, which, you know, may sound like a crazy thing for a freshman to be made vice chairman. But, you know, the problem was that they didn't have many lawyers in the legislature. Everybody's always criticizing the legislature having too many lawyers, and, you know, but there were less than 20% of the whole legislature were lawyers. And so in the Senate, most of the work was done in the Judiciary Committee, because, you know, that was the only place you had you know, concentration of lawyers to help write the bills and everything. I mean, of course, we had a legislative council, and they did most of the actual drafting. But it was important to have somebody that had some legal knowledge on the Judiciary Committee. So Zell said, look, tell me what committees you want to be on, but you're going to have to be on the Judiciary Committee, because I just don't have enough lawyers. And and then he made me vice chairman. And I became fast friends with the chairman, who was Nathan Deal from Gainesville, and who, of course, just got elected governor. But Nathan and I shared a secretary in the newly renovated legislative office building across the street. Offices right next to each other, and we worked very closely on the Judiciary Committee issues. Another issue that I was real interested in, though, was toll-free countywide calling. You know, back then, there were so many different telephone companies in Georgia, and each one had their own little fiefdom. And if you called outside of that, you had to pay a long distance fee. So there are many counties, including Franklin County, where I was from. I lived in Hart at that time, but Hart had the same issue. But Franklin is basically where Royston, most of Royston is. And there were 3 different telephone companies operating in Franklin County. So you couldn't call the school, you couldn't call, sometimes cross the street without paying a long distance charge. So that was the first project I took on in the state Senate, was to get toll-free countywide calling. And at first, Southern Bell was on my side. They thought it was a fight against the Bells, against the small companies, and small, you know, independent companies. But in the end, I had to fight Southern Bell also, because the bill we came up with affected them in some ways that they thought were, it was going in a different direction than they wanted to go. What they wanted to do was to have charge based on the distance. And I don't remember all the details now, but they fought me tooth and toenail, and ultimately the small companies got behind it. And so I was just fighting Southern Bell. And you know, I didn't give a lot of speeches in the state Senate. When I had to, I'd get down there and give one. But the speech I gave on this toll-free countywide calling thing was when I was fighting Southern Bell. I had some friends, the lobbyists for Southern Bell were friends of mine, but we didn't stay friends during this time because I said in my speech, I said, Southern Bell is like the hog that eats all the feed in the trough and then gets in it when it gets full where nobody else can get any. And that became the quote of the day in the Atlanta papers. And I used to say after that, I said, you know, the only way rural legislators ever get quoted is by using a double negative or saying ain't or have something about a farm animal in it. You know, because they had this perception of rural legislators being, you know, country boys that didn't know anything. So they'd always put their quotes in there if they had a double negative or ain't or something about a farm animal in it to make them, to ridicule them in some ways. But anyway, first time we took a vote on that, it failed. And you know, I'll tell you a funny story about it too. Was I got more than half of the Senate, Republican and Democrat, to sign on to this bill with me. First, we formed a study committee. Zell appointed this study committee that I asked him to appoint. We went all around the state, finding out what the issues were around the state. And so when we got back, we came up with this report and then introduced a bill, and I got over half the legislature, half the Senate to sign on to it. And of course, it's very popular in the House too, because they had the same problem over there. And when I dropped that bill with all those names on it, Southern Bell just went crazy, you know. And so, and one of the people that I had to sign on to it was Wayne Garner. I'll never forget what he said to me, because he knew Southern Bell was against it. And Wayne was a very funny guy and a good friend of mine. But he said to me, Don, I'm going to sign this bill with you, but I'm getting off it in Augusta. And what he meant by that was, and this is not to say he was being bribed, but the Southern Bell lobbyists used to take a bunch of legislators to the Masters every year. And so he said, I'm on this bill as long as I can still go to the Masters. He said, I'm getting off in Augusta.